In 1913, the United States had approximately 155 medical schools. By 1923, that number had been cut roughly in half. By 1939, every Herbal medical school in the country had been closed. The closures were justified by a report published in 1910. The report was funded by a foundation. The foundation had interests that, the report did not say, were not strictly medical. Replaced. Hold that word. It is the word the title uses, and it is the word that does the most work in this story. The schools were replaced. Some were closed outright. Some merged with other institutions. Some persisted under new ownership, with new curricula, with new philosophies of practice. By 1939, every American medical school that taught herbal medicine as its primary therapeutic framework was gone. The replacement happened in stages. It happened slowly. It happened through ordinary mechanisms of philanthropic funding, professional accreditation, and state licensure. It did not happen by decree. It did not happen by force. It happened, in the way that institutional transformations tend to happen, by the accumulating weight of small decisions, each defensible on its own terms, that together produced an outcome that no single decision could have authorized. The outcome was the elimination of an entire medical tradition. I want to walk you through how that happened. Let me tell you how I came to this story. I spent 4 weeks this past autumn at 2 archives. The first was the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York, a research facility in a converted estate building on the Pocantico Hills, about 20 miles north of Manhattan. The Rockefeller Archive Center holds the records of the Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and several related philanthropic institutions. The second archive was the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland, on the campus of the National Institutes of Health. The National Library of Medicine holds the largest collection of historical American medical literature in the country. Its History of Medicine division contains substantial holdings on 19th century American medical sectarian movements, homeopathy, eclectic medicine, Thomsonianism, naturopathy. I had gone to these archives to research a different question. I was looking into the history of American philanthropic foundations in the early 20th century. The Carnegie, Rockefeller, Russell Sage, and other large foundations that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that shaped the institutional landscape of American higher education, social science, and public health. I had not, when I went in, intended to focus on medical education specifically. What I found in the Rockefeller archives was that the medical education reform of the 1910s and 1920s was one of the largest and most consequential of the Foundation's early programs. The General Education Board, which had been founded in 1903, made grants to American medical schools that, in aggregate, were larger than the combined endowments of most American universities at the time. The Rockefeller Foundation, after its formal establishment in 1913, continued and expanded the program. By the end of the 1920s, the foundation had given approximately $80 million to American medical education, an amount that, in 1920s dollars, exceeded the entire annual federal budget for higher education. That is a substantial investment. I started reading about what the investment had done. You do not need to hold every school. You do not need to track every closure. The schools closed 110 years ago. The records of their closure have been in archives for nearly that long. They are not going anywhere tonight. The boxes wait at Sleepy Hollow. The materia medica volumes wait on the shelves of the National Library of Medicine. We have time. Sit back. Let the lamp dim if you like. Let me describe the medical landscape that the reform transformed. In 1900, American medicine was a pluralistic profession. There were multiple coexisting medical traditions, each with its own schools, its own professional associations, its own state licensing arrangements, and its own patient base. The largest tradition was what was then called regular or allopathic medicine. This was the tradition that traced itself back to European university medicine, to the medical schools of Bologna, Padua, Paris, and Vienna. By 1900, allopathic medicine had begun to incorporate the discoveries of 19th century science: germ theory, antisepsis, pharmacology, modern surgery. The allopathic schools were the largest, the best funded, and the most prestigious. The second largest tradition was homeopathy. Homeopathy had been founded in Germany in the 1790s by Samuel Hahnemann. It had been brought to the United States in the 1820s and had grown rapidly. By 1900, there were approximately 20 homeopathic medical schools in the country, with thousands of practicing homeopathic physicians. The third tradition was eclectic medicine. Eclectic medicine had been founded in the 1830s by Worcester Beach in New York. It had spread westward, becoming particularly strong in Ohio, Indiana, and the broader Midwest. By 1900, there were approximately 20 eclectic medical schools concentrated heavily in the Midwest. The Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati was the leading school of the tradition. Eclectic medicine was, in its therapeutic orientation, primarily herbal and botanical. The eclectic schools taught the medicinal uses of North American plants, bloodroot, golden seal, black cohosh, lobelia, and several hundred others. They produced extensive materia medica volumes documenting the properties and uses of these plants. They published journals. They maintained an active professional community. Smaller medical traditions also existed. The Thomsonian movement, which had been a major sectarian force in the 1820s and 1830s, had largely been absorbed into the eclectic tradition by 1900. Naturopathy and osteopathy were emerging as distinct movements in the late 1890s. Chiropractic was founded in 1895 by Daniel David Palmer in Iowa. Let me give you some sense of the scale. In 1900, there were approximately 130,000 practicing physicians in the United States. Of these, the breakdown by tradition was approximately as follows. Allopathic physicians constituted about 70% of the total, roughly 90,000 practitioners. Homeopathic physicians constituted about 12%, roughly 16,000 practitioners. Eclectic physicians constituted about 5%, roughly 6,500 practitioners. The remaining 13% were divided among osteopathic, chiropractic, naturopathic, and various smaller traditions. These figures are approximate. The census-style enumeration of medical practitioners by tradition was inconsistent in the period. Different state licensing boards counted practitioners in different ways. Some practitioners straddled traditions, having trained in one and practicing in another. The figures should be understood as rough indicators rather than precise counts. What the figures indicate, however, is that medical pluralism in 1900 was substantial. Roughly 30% of American physicians were practicing within non-allopathic traditions. That is not a negligible fraction. It represents a substantial portion of American medical practice, operating outside the framework that would become dominant after the Flexner Reform. I want to give one more perspective on the scale. The major sectarian medical traditions had their own professional associations, their own journals, their own continuing education programs. The American Institute of Homeopathy, founded in 1844, was older than the American Medical Association. The National Eclectic Medical Association, founded in 1848, was nearly as old. The Journal of the American Institute of Homeopathy and the Eclectic Medical Journal were respected publications within their traditions. They published clinical case reports, pharmacological observations, theoretical discussions, and continuing education materials. The sectarian traditions were not, in other words, marginal movements operating at the fringe of American medicine. They were established components of the medical landscape with substantial institutional infrastructure that the Flexner Reform would, in the course of the next 30 years, largely dismantle. These traditions, taken together, constituted American medical practice in 1900. They coexisted, sometimes competitively, with state licensing arrangements that often recognize practitioners from multiple traditions. I want to be clear about something. The American medical landscape in 1900 was not uniformly excellent. Many of the schools were underfunded. Many of the practitioners were inadequately trained. Patient outcomes across all traditions were poor by modern standards. The hygiene practices of the era were primitive. Effective antibiotics did not exist. Surgical mortality was high. The pluralism of American medicine in 1900 was not in itself a guarantee of quality. There were good schools and bad schools in every tradition. There were skilled practitioners and incompetent practitioners in every tradition. The system had real problems. What I am describing is the structural diversity of the system, not its quality. The system contained multiple competing approaches to medicine, each with its own institutional infrastructure. The reform that occurred between 1910 and 1939 did not just improve the quality of medical education, it also collapsed the structural diversity. The two changes happened together. The quality improvement and the structural collapse are not the same thing. They are sometimes treated as if they were the same thing, as if eliminating the inadequate schools required, eliminating the diversity of traditions. But the two are conceptually distinct. A reform that improved the quality of medical education without collapsing the diversity of traditions would have been possible. The reform that actually occurred did both. Let me describe the Flexner Report. The Flexner Report was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching in 1908. The commission was at the request of the Council on Medical Education of the American Medical Association, which had been established in 1904 and which had been working for several years on the question of standardizing American medical education. The Council on Medical Education had conducted its own initial survey of medical schools in 1906. The survey had produced a tentative classification of schools by quality, but the Council had judged that it could not publish the results without independent confirmation. The AMA was, at the time, a professional association with a clear interest in the outcome of any quality assessment. The Council wanted a more disinterested, institutional sponsor for the assessment. The Carnegie Foundation was chosen. The foundation had been established in 1905 by Andrew Carnegie. Its primary mission was the support of higher education. It had recently completed a comparable survey of American higher education in general. It had the institutional standing to conduct a follow-up survey of medical education without obvious conflict of interest. The foundation selected Abraham Flexner to conduct the survey. Flexner was, at the time, a 38-year-old educator with a background in classical education rather than medicine. He had been principal of a private secondary school in Louisville, Kentucky. He had written a book, The American College, a criticism published in 1908 that had attracted foundation attention. Flexner was not a physician. He had no formal training in medicine. He had no extensive prior knowledge of American medical schools. I want to spend a moment with Flexner the man, because he is sometimes treated, in the conspiratorial readings of this story, as if he were a deliberate agent of pharmaceutical interests, rather than as a person with his own background, training and concerns. Flexner was born in 1866 in Louisville, Kentucky, to a Jewish immigrant family. His parents had emigrated from Bohemia in the 1850s. His father was a hat maker. The family was, by the standards of late 19th century Louisville, middle class but not wealthy. Flexner attended Johns Hopkins University as an undergraduate, graduating in 1886. Hopkins was, at the time, the leading American university committed to the German university model, research-oriented, faculty-led, with strong emphasis on the natural sciences. Flexner's exposure to Hopkins during his undergraduate years shaped his subsequent views about educational quality. After Hopkins, Flexner returned to Louisville and worked as a teacher. He eventually founded his own private secondary school, the Flexner School, which he ran for 19 years. The school operated on progressive educational principles and was, by the accounts of its former students, an effective institution. Flexner left the school in 1905 to study briefly at Harvard and then at the University of Berlin, where he encountered firsthand the German university and secondary school systems that had shaped Hopkins. In 1908, Flexner published The American College, a criticism, a book that was sharply critical of American higher education and that argued for reforms along German university lines. The book attracted the attention of Henry S. Pritchett, president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Pritchett offered Flexner the Medical Education Survey Commission. Flexner was, in other words, an educator who had been shaped by exposure to the German university model and who had developed strong views about the deficiencies of American higher education. He brought those views to the Medical Education Survey. He was not, in any defensible reading, a pharmaceutical industry agent. He was a particular kind of educational reformer with a particular set of intellectual commitments who was given an opportunity to apply those commitments to American medical education. The commitments shaped the report. The report's preference for the German university model was Flexner's preference. The report's criticisms of inadequately resourced schools reflected Flexner's view that American education needed to be more rigorous and better resourced. The report's framework was Flexner's framework. This does not absolve Flexner of responsibility for what the report did. He was the author. He made the evaluations. He recommended the consolidations. The consequences of the report were, in significant part, the consequences he had advocated. But it places his role in a particular context. He was not a hidden agent. He was a visible educational reformer, working within a coalition that included foundation officials and professional medical leaders, applying a coherent set of educational values to American medical education. The coalition is the more important thing. Flexner alone could not have produced the transformation. The foundation funding, the AMA licensing reforms, the state legislative changes, these required the broader coalition. Flexner was the author of the report. The coalition was the author of the reform. This was, in some sense, intentional. The foundation wanted an outside evaluator who would not be embedded in the existing professional networks. Flexner's lack of medical credentials was treated as a feature rather than a bug. In 1909 and 1910, Flexner travelled to all 155 American medical schools. He spent typically a day or two at each. He inspected facilities, examined curricula, interviewed faculty, observed classes where possible. He took notes. He returned to New York. He wrote the report. The report was published by the Carnegie Foundation on June 4, 1910. It was 364 pages. It evaluated each of the 155 schools by name. It graded them, in effect, on a scale from inadequate to excellent. I want to describe what the report said. The report's broad conclusions were, first, that American medical education was, in general, badly behind the standards being set in European medical schools, particularly the German universities. The report explicitly held up the German model, exemplified in the United States by Johns Hopkins, which had been established in 1893 along German lines, as the standard to which American medical education should aspire. Second, that there were too many American medical schools. The report recommended that the number be reduced to approximately 31. The recommendation was based on the population that medical schools were judged adequate to serve, the resource constraints of supporting more schools at acceptable quality, and the need for concentration of expertise and infrastructure. Third, that the surviving schools should be university-affiliated, 4-year curriculum institutions with full-time faculty, extensive laboratory facilities, and clinical training in affiliated teaching hospitals. The schools that did not meet this standard should be closed. Fourth, that the sectarian medical schools, homeopathic, eclectic, and others, were either to meet the new standards, in which case they would, in effect, cease to be sectarian, since the new standards required allopathic scientific frameworks, or to close. These were the report's broad conclusions. The report also contained specific evaluations of each of the 155 schools. The evaluations ranged from highly favourable for schools like Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania, to scathing for many of the smaller, less well-funded schools, including most of the sectarian schools. The report was, in its specific evaluations, often technically accurate. Many of the schools the report criticised were genuinely inadequate. They had small or non-existent laboratory facilities. They had part-time faculty with limited research credentials. They had short curricula, sometimes only 2 years rather than the 4 years the report recommended. They had inadequate clinical training arrangements. The eclectic and homeopathic schools were, in their material conditions, often substantially worse than the leading allopathic schools. The Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati had modest facilities. Its faculty was largely part-time. Its laboratory equipment was limited. Its clinical training was not as integrated with hospital practice as the Hopkins model. In the strict technical evaluation, the report's criticisms of the sectarian schools were, in many cases, defensible. I want to be clear about this. The report was not a fabrication. The schools it criticised were, by the report's own criteria, genuinely below the standard the report was promoting. The question is whether the criteria the report was promoting were the appropriate criteria for evaluating American medical education in 1910. And the question is whether the consequences of applying those criteria were proportionate to the deficiencies they identified. I want to walk through the consequences. The report was published in June 1910. By the end of 1910, several state legislatures had begun to revise their medical licensing requirements to align with the report's recommendations. By 1915, most state licensing boards had adopted the report's framework. By 1920, the licensing structure of American medicine had been substantially transformed. The transformation worked through licensing. If a state required a 4-year university-affiliated curriculum for medical licensure, then graduates of 2-year sectarian schools could not be licensed in that state. If state after state adopted that requirement, then sectarian medical education became, in effect, useless. The schools that taught sectarian medicine were producing graduates who could not practice medicine. The schools responded in various ways. Some closed outright. Some merged with allopathic institutions, abandoning their sectarian frameworks. Some attempted to upgrade to meet the new standards, with mixed success. The Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati, the leading eclectic school, attempted the upgrade. It extended its curriculum. It hired additional faculty. It improved its facilities. By the early 1920s, it was a 4-year institution with reasonable facilities, by the standards of the day. It still closed. The school closed in 1923. The closure was not for inability to meet the curricular standards. The closure was for financial insufficiency. The school could not, after the elimination of its student base in states that did not recognize eclectic licensure, generate the tuition revenue required to operate. Without the licensing recognition, students could not afford to attend. Without students, the school could not continue. The Eclectic Medical Institute closed not because it failed the Flexner standard, but because the broader transformation of American medical licensing made the eclectic tradition financially unsustainable. I want to give you a moment to sit with that. The Flexner Report did not, in its text, call for the elimination of the eclectic tradition. It evaluated the eclectic schools, generally unfavourably, on the same criteria it applied to the allopathic schools. It recommended that the eclectic schools either meet the new standards or close. The transformation that followed, however, was not just about meeting the new standards. It was about the broader restructuring of American medical licensing, in ways that, even when eclectic schools did meet the new standards, made the eclectic tradition financially unviable. The report was, in its text, a quality improvement document. The report, in its consequences, was a structural transformation document. The two things are not the same. I want to give you a breath here. We have walked through the medical landscape of 1900, the broad strokes of the Flexner Report, the consequences of the reform on the eclectic schools, the question of who Flexner was. You do not need to hold every detail. The story is not going anywhere. The report is publicly available. The schools that closed are documented. The records of the closure are in archives that have been open for decades. Sit with the sketch for a moment. American medicine in 1900, pluralistic, with multiple traditions, each with its own schools and professional associations. A reform initiated in 1908 by the AMA's Council on Medical Education, conducted by Abraham Flexner under Carnegie Foundation sponsorship, with subsequent funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. The reform's stated purpose: improving medical education. The reform's broader consequence: the elimination of medical pluralism and the concentration of authority within a specific institutional framework. I want to describe one of my visits to the Rockefeller Archive Center. The Archive Center is housed in a building that was once part of the Rockefeller family's Pocantico Hills estate. It is in Westchester County, about an hour by train from Manhattan. The building is set back from the road, surrounded by what was once estate grounds, and is now a mix of preserved historic landscape and modern conservation property. The reading room is small. There are perhaps a dozen seats at long oak tables with reading lamps. The staff is small but knowledgeable. The boxes are delivered from the closed stacks on rolling carts. I had requested, over the course of 3 days, boxes from the General Education Board's Medical Education series. The boxes were tied with cotton tape. The folders inside were arranged chronologically, with the typescripts and handwritten letters from the period 1908 to 1915 carefully preserved. In one folder, I came across a typewritten document that I had not been expecting. The document was a memorandum, dated September 1910, 3 months after the publication of the Flexner Report. The memorandum was from Frederick T. Gates to Wallace Buttrick, the Secretary of the General Education Board. The subject line read, Future of Medical Education Program. The memorandum was several pages long. It outlined a strategy for the board's medical education work going forward in light of the Flexner Report's recommendations. One passage in the memorandum stopped me. The passage read, The Flexner survey has identified the schools that, in our judgment, deserve continued support and the schools that should not. The next phase of our work is to ensure that the surviving schools become exemplars of the new model and to ensure that the others find their natural conclusion. We need not be involved in closing the schools that should close. The licensing reforms underway in the state legislatures, combined with the loss of standing that will follow from publication of the survey, will accomplish what is needed. Our task is to provide the constructive complement to build the schools that should survive. I read that passage 3 times. What it describes, in careful philanthropic language, is the strategy of letting the licensing reforms close the sectarian schools while the foundation funds the schools the foundation wants to succeed. The foundation does not have to close any schools. The foundation can stay constructive. The closures will be accomplished by other actors. The state legislatures, the AMA's Council on Medical Education, the dynamics of competitive funding. While the foundation focuses on building, the strategy was, in retrospect, exactly what occurred. The foundation built, the licensing reforms closed. The two operated in coordination without the foundation needing to be directly involved in the closures. The memorandum is not, in itself, a smoking gun. It is a strategic document describing what the foundation's leadership intended to do with their medical education program. The strategy was, at the time, defensible in terms the foundation's leadership would have used: strengthening scientific medicine, building exemplary institutions, supporting quality improvement. The strategy was also, in its effect, a deliberate plan to allow the sectarian schools to close without the foundation needing to take direct responsibility for the closures. Hold this. I want to walk you through the funding picture. The Rockefeller Foundation, between 1913 and 1929, gave approximately $80 million to American medical schools. The General Education Board, which was the Rockefeller philanthropic vehicle that operated before the foundation's formal establishment, had given an additional substantial amount in the preceding decade. The grants were not distributed evenly across all American medical schools. They were heavily concentrated in a small number of leading institutions: Johns Hopkins, Harvard, the University of Chicago, Yale, Columbia, Washington University in St. Louis, and a handful of others. The grants were also conditional. To receive a foundation grant, a medical school had to meet specific institutional criteria. It had to be university affiliated. It had to have a 4-year curriculum. It had to have full-time faculty. It had to teach what the foundation considered scientific medicine. The criteria by 1913 were the criteria of the Flexner Report. The schools that received foundation funding became the leading American medical schools. They got better facilities, better faculty, better laboratories. They produced better trained graduates. They consolidated their institutional position. The schools that did not receive foundation funding, the sectarian schools, the smaller allopathic schools, the schools that did not meet the foundation's criteria, were left to operate on tuition revenue and modest local philanthropy. Their financial position deteriorated relative to the funded schools. They struggled to keep up. The foundation's funding decisions were, by themselves, transformative. The foundation did not have to close any schools directly. The foundation simply funded the schools it preferred at levels that made those schools the dominant institutions in American medicine. The other schools, deprived of comparable funding, fell behind. I want to walk you through the relationship between the foundations and the AMA's medical education program. The relationship was close. It was also documented in the surviving correspondence at the Rockefeller Archive Center. Frederick T. Gates, the Rockefeller philanthropic advisor, corresponded extensively with the leadership of the AMA's Council on Medical Education throughout the 1910s. The correspondence shows substantial coordination on the medical education reform program. In a letter from Gates to John D. Rockefeller Sr., dated April 1912, Gates wrote that the AMA's licensing reforms and the Foundation's grant program were mutually reinforcing instruments in the effort to rationalize American medical practice. In a letter from the AMA Council on Medical Education to the Carnegie Foundation, dated October 1913, The Council's chairman thanked the Foundation for the continued cooperation that has made the present reorganisation possible. These letters are not, on their face, evidence of conspiracy. They are evidence of the kind of coordinated philanthropic and professional activity that was common in the early 20th century American institutional landscape. The Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, the AMA's Council on Medical Education, the state licensing boards, and the leading medical schools formed a coordinated network whose members worked together on the medical education reform. The network was not secret. The coordination was largely visible in the public record. The Flexner Report itself was a product of the coordination. What the network produced, working together, was the transformation of American medical education along specific lines that serve specific institutional interests. I want to address the specific institutional interests. The leading allopathic medical schools, Hopkins, Harvard, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Yale, Columbia, were the institutional beneficiaries of the reform. They received the Rockefeller and Carnegie funding. They gained relative position in American medicine. They became, in effect, the dominant institutions in the post-reform landscape. The American Medical Association was the professional beneficiary. The AMA's Council on Medical Education gained control, through the licensing system, over the standards by which American medical practice would be certified. The AMA itself became the dominant professional organisation in American medicine. Displacing the various sectarian professional associations. The Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations were the philanthropic beneficiaries. Their grants positioned them as the principal funders of American medical research. The institutional network they built, the schools, the research institutes, the professional associations, became the platform for subsequent foundation activity in American medicine throughout the 20th century. The pharmaceutical industry was, in time, the economic beneficiary. The standardization of American medical practice within a specific framework, a framework that emphasized manufactured drugs over botanical preparations, that valued laboratory-based research over empirical herbalism, that operated through hospital and clinic settings, amenable to industrial-scale distribution, created the market conditions that allowed the pharmaceutical industry to grow as it did in the mid-20th century. This consequence was not, in 1910, the primary motivation. It was by the 1932nd, the largely realized outcome. The losers were the sectarian medical traditions. The eclectic and homeopathic schools, with their botanical and dilutional therapeutic frameworks, were structurally disadvantaged by the reform. The institutional framework that supported them was dismantled. The professional pathways for their practitioners were closed. The materia medica traditions they had developed were displaced from the medical mainstream. I want to give you a breath here. The story I've walked through so far is, in its broad outlines, the standard story of the Flexner reform. The story is well documented. The Rockefeller and Carnegie roles are acknowledged. The AMA's role is acknowledged. The decline of the sectarian schools is acknowledged. What is sometimes less emphasized in the standard tellings is the magnitude of what was lost when the sectarian schools closed. The eclectic tradition, in particular, had accumulated substantial knowledge about the medicinal uses of North American plants. The materia medica volumes produced by the eclectic schools, by Felter and Lloyd, by Scudder, by King, contained detailed pharmacological information about hundreds of plant species. The information was empirical. It was based on clinical use, often over decades. It was sometimes flawed by the limitations of the period's analytical methods, but it was not, in general, fraudulent. When the eclectic schools closed, the institutional framework for transmitting and developing this knowledge ended. The materia medica volumes remained, in libraries. The knowledge embodied in the volumes was not, however, incorporated into the post-reform American medical mainstream. Allopathic medicine did not, in any substantial way, pick up where eclectic medicine left off. The botanical research that had been done was, in effect, set aside. Some of this research has been picked up in later decades, in fragments by other research traditions. Modern pharmacognosy, ethnobotany, complementary and alternative medicine research. The recovery has been partial. Some of the eclectic era research has been confirmed by modern analytical methods. Some has been refined. Some has been disconfirmed. Some has not been examined at all. What the eclectic tradition accumulated over roughly 80 years of clinical practice was a body of empirical knowledge about plant-based therapeutics. The body of knowledge was not perfect. It was, however, substantial. The reform that eliminated the institutional framework for transmitting that knowledge did so without comprehensive consideration of what was being lost. I want to walk you through one specific case. The Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio, was founded by the Lloyd brothers, John Uri Lloyd, Curtis Gates Lloyd, and Nelson Ashley Lloyd, beginning in the 1880s. The Lloyds were eclectic pharmacists who built a substantial business, preparing botanical pharmaceuticals for the eclectic medical profession. They also built a library. The Lloyd Library, by the time the Eclectic Medical Institute closed in 1923, contained one of the largest collections of botanical and pharmaceutical literature in the United States. It included thousands of volumes of materia medica, herbal pharmacopoeias, ethnobotanical works, and clinical case reports. The library survived the closure of the Eclectic Medical Institute. It still exists today as the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati. It is open to researchers. It continues to acquire material in the broad field of botanical and pharmaceutical history. The library's existence is a small consolation. The institutional framework that the library supported, the eclectic medical schools, the eclectic clinical practice, the active research and publication community that drew on the library, is gone. The library is a memorial. It is not a working institutional centre. I have been to the Lloyd Library. I spent 3 days there in October. The reading room is small and quiet. The collections are extensive. The staff is knowledgeable and helpful. Walking through the stacks, I had the sense that I have had in several archives in the course of this work, of being in the presence of a substantial intellectual tradition that had been preserved in physical form, but that no longer had a living institutional community. The volumes are there. The community that produced them and used them is not. I want to take a moment with that. The eclectic medical tradition produced between 1830 and 1923 a body of literature that, by my best estimate, runs to several thousand published volumes. That body of literature documented the clinical practice of a community of physicians who treated millions of American patients over nearly a century. The documentation includes pharmacological data, clinical case reports, theoretical frameworks, and educational materials. The closure of the eclectic schools did not destroy the literature. The literature exists in the Lloyd Library and in other collections, accessible to anyone who chooses to read it. The closure did, however, end the living tradition. There are today no eclectic medical schools. There is no professional organisation of eclectic physicians. There is no journal publishing eclectic clinical research. The licensure systems do not recognise eclectic medical training. The tradition exists as a historical artefact. It does not exist as a continuing professional community. In some sense, this is what happens to most medical traditions over long enough time. The medicine of the 18th century is no longer practiced. The medicine of the 19th century is no longer practiced. The medicine of the 21st century will, in time, also be largely superseded. In the eclectic case, however, the supersession was not gradual. It was rapid. It was deliberate. It was the product of specific institutional decisions made by specific, identifiable actors operating in a specific historical moment. The tradition did not fade out. It was, in a relatively short period, eliminated as an active community. I want to walk you through the broader question of what the reform did to American medical pluralism. Before the reform, American medicine was pluralistic. Multiple traditions coexisted. Each tradition had its own institutional infrastructure. Each tradition was, to varying degrees, recognized by state licensing boards. After the reform, American medicine was largely mono-orientational. The post-reform American medical landscape was dominated by allopathic medicine, practiced within a specific institutional framework. University-affiliated medical schools, hospital-based clinical training, full-time scientific faculty, research orientation toward laboratory methods, and pharmaceutical therapy. The pluralism did not disappear entirely. Homeopathic medicine survived in modest form. Osteopathic medicine, which had been founded in 1874 by Andrew Taylor Still, survived and eventually integrated with allopathic medicine while retaining some distinctive features. Chiropractic survived as a separate licensed profession in most states. Naturopathy survived in a small number of jurisdictions, but the dominant framework, the framework that produced the majority of physicians, the framework recognized by the broadest range of state licensing arrangements, the framework that received the major philanthropic funding, was allopathic medicine practiced within the post-Flexner institutional structure. The structural diversity of American medicine, which had been a feature of the system in 1900, was substantially reduced by 1939. The reform achieved what the AMA's Council on Medical Education had set out to achieve in 1904: the standardization of American medical practice within a specific institutional framework. I want to give you a breath here. The story I've been walking through is, in its broad outlines, well documented. The Flexner Report exists. The Rockefeller and Carnegie funding records exist. The AMA's licensing reform records exist. The closure dates of the eclectic and homeopathic schools are documented. What is less well documented, in the standard historiography, is the framing of the reform as something other than what it was. The standard framing treats the reform as a story of scientific modernization. The reform improved American medical education. It eliminated inadequate schools. It produced better trained physicians. It contributed to the dramatic improvements in American medical outcomes in the 20th century. This framing is true as far as it goes. The reform did contribute to all of these outcomes. The framing is also incomplete. The reform did other things as well. It eliminated medical pluralism. It positioned a specific institutional coalition as the dominant force in American medicine. It set the stage for the subsequent growth of the pharmaceutical industry. It severed the connection between American medicine and the botanical medical tradition that had been a major component of American healthcare for nearly a century. The standard framing, by emphasizing the first set of consequences and de-emphasizing the second set, has had the effect of obscuring the full character of what was done. I want to spend some time with the question of pharmaceutical interests. The transformation of American medicine between roughly 1910 and 1940 occurred in parallel with the emergence of the American pharmaceutical industry. The two transformations are connected. The connections are documented, though the documentation is sometimes scattered across different archives. Before 1910, the American pharmaceutical industry was relatively small and decentralized. There were many small drug companies, often operating regionally, producing both manufactured pharmaceuticals and prepared botanical remedies. The major drug companies of the period, Parke-Davis, Eli Lilly, SmithKline French, Squibb, were established firms, but they were not yet the integrated research and manufacturing operations they would become. By 1940, the American pharmaceutical industry had become a substantially different entity. The major companies were larger, more research-oriented, more integrated across the development, manufacturing, distribution chain. They had close relationships with the major medical schools, with the AMA's Council on Medical Education, and with the federal regulatory framework that had emerged through the Food and Drug Administration. The transformation of the pharmaceutical industry was, in part, enabled by the transformation of American medical practice. A medical system dominated by allopathic medicine, oriented toward laboratory-developed pharmaceuticals rather than empirical botanical remedies, provided a market that the modern pharmaceutical industry could serve at scale. The industry developed in response to that market. I want to be careful here. The relationship between the medical education reform and the pharmaceutical industry was not, in any document I have been able to find, articulated as a deliberate joint project. The reformers did not say in their correspondence that they were building a medical system that would serve a pharmaceutical industry that would emerge to serve that system. The two transformations emerged together in a kind of mutual enablement, without either being explicitly designed to produce the other. But the mutual enablement was real. The medical system that the reform produced was a system that pharmaceutical companies could serve. The pharmaceutical industry that emerged became a major economic force in American medicine. The interaction between them shaped 20th century American healthcare in ways that the original reformers could not have fully anticipated, but that they would, I think, have been generally supportive of, had they foreseen them. Before I walk you through a specific document, let me sketch what the funding actually looked like in practice. A typical Rockefeller Foundation grant to a leading medical school in the years between 1913 and 1925 was on the order of $1 to $5 million. In 1920 dollars, these were enormous sums. The University of Chicago received approximately $5 million to establish its medical school as a full research institution. Johns Hopkins received multiple grants totaling more than $10 million over the period to expand its facilities and faculty. Vanderbilt received approximately $7 million to build a new medical school from the ground up. These were not, by any historical standard, modest grants. They were transformative investments that allowed the recipient institutions to make capital and personnel commitments that they could not have made on their own resources. The schools that received the grants made the commitments. They built new laboratory buildings. They hired faculty at salaries that competed with industrial salaries. They built or expanded teaching hospitals. They constructed libraries. They established research institutes affiliated with the medical schools. The schools that did not receive the grants did not make these commitments. They operated on tuition revenue and modest local donations. Their facilities remained modest. Their faculty remained small. Their research programs remained, by comparison with the funded schools, minimal. The competitive gap between funded and unfunded schools widened year by year. By 1925, the funded schools were operating in a different world from the unfunded ones. The funded schools were producing research, publishing in major journals, and graduating physicians who could compete for positions at other leading institutions. The unfunded schools were teaching the same core curriculum, but with fewer resources, less prestigious faculty, and graduates whose career prospects were measurably constrained. The widening gap was not by itself evidence that the unfunded schools were inadequate. It was evidence that the funding pattern had created two tiers of American medical education. The upper tier, the funded schools, became the elite institutions of American medicine. The lower tier, the unfunded schools, either closed or persisted as second-rank institutions. I want to walk through one more dimension of the funding picture. The grants were not, in most cases, no-strings-attached gifts. They came with conditions. The conditions required specific curricular structures, specific institutional arrangements, specific governance frameworks. To receive the funding, the schools had to commit to operating in ways the foundation considered appropriate. The conditions were, in their substance, the foundation's preferences as articulated by Frederick T. Gates, William Welch, and the other figures who shaped the medical education program. The schools that accepted the funding accepted these preferences. They committed to the four-year university-affiliated curriculum. They committed to full-time research faculty. They committed to the kind of laboratory infrastructure the foundation wanted to see. The commitments shaped the schools in ways that, over time, became inseparable from the school's own identities. By the 1930s and 1940s, the leading American medical schools could not easily distinguish their own institutional preferences from the preferences that the foundation funding had instilled in them. The funding had become part of how the schools defined themselves. This is, in some sense, how influential philanthropy works. The funding shapes the institutions. The institutions, shaped by the funding, internalize the funder's preferences. The funder's preferences become, over time, the institution's own preferences. The shaping is, by the time it is complete, invisible to the institutions themselves. The post-Flexner American medical schools, by mid-century, did not generally think of themselves as instruments of Rockefeller philanthropic policy. They thought of themselves as the institutions of American scientific medicine. The thinking was, in some sense, correct. They were the institutions of American scientific medicine. They were also, simultaneously, the institutions that the Rockefeller philanthropy had built. The two descriptions referred to the same entity. I want to walk you through a specific document. In the Rockefeller Archive Center, in the General Education Board records, there is a file titled Medical Education. Strategic Considerations. The file contains internal memoranda, draft policy documents, and correspondence from the period 1908 to 1915. One document in the file, dated November 1909, is a memorandum from Frederick T. Gates to the General Education Board's Medical Education Subcommittee. The memorandum addresses the question of how to structure the board's medical education program in light of what Gates expected from the forthcoming Flexner Report. The memorandum is several pages long. It is detailed. It is internal, clearly intended for committee discussion rather than public circulation. In one passage, Gates writes, "The objective of our program is not solely the improvement of medical education in the technical sense. It is the establishment in the United States of a coherent system of medical practice based on the natural sciences and on the institutional model of the modern university. Achieving this objective requires us to be selective in our support of medical schools. We must support those institutions that will become exemplars of the new model, and we must allow others to find their own resolution within the changing landscape." The phrase "allow others to find their own resolution within the changing landscape" is, in its careful institutional language, the policy of letting the sectarian schools close. The phrase does not say we will close the eclectic schools. It says, in effect, that the foundation will fund the schools it wants to succeed and will leave the others to whatever fate the changing landscape produces. The changing landscape, as Gates and his colleagues knew, was being shaped by the Flexner Report, by the AMA's licensing reforms, and by the Foundation's own funding decisions. The changing landscape was, in significant part, what the coalition was building. Letting the sectarian schools find their own resolution within it was, in effect, a policy of structural elimination through selective funding. I want to be careful with this document. The document does not, on its face, articulate a conspiracy to destroy herbal medicine. It articulates a strategy for promoting a specific model of medical education. The promotion of that model would, as a consequence, marginalize alternative models. The marginalization is not the explicit objective. The explicit objective is the establishment of the preferred model. The marginalization is a consequence. This is, in some sense, what makes the historiographical question complicated. The actors involved did not, in the surviving documents, describe themselves as engaged in the elimination of herbal medicine. They described themselves as engaged in the establishment of scientific medicine. The elimination of herbal medicine was, from their perspective, a side effect of the establishment they were pursuing. The side effect was, however, foreseeable. The Foundation's leadership understood what their funding decisions would mean for the schools they did not fund. The AMA's leadership understood what their licensing reforms would mean for the practitioners they did not license. The Carnegie Foundation's leadership understood what the publication of the Flexner Report would mean for the schools it criticized. The actors did not intend the destruction of herbal medicine in the way that, for example, the Spanish conquistadors intended the destruction of Aztec religion. They did intend the establishment of a system that would have, as a consequence, the marginalization of herbal medicine. The marginalization was knowable. It was, by 1915 at the latest, clearly occurring. It was not, in the surviving correspondence, treated as a regrettable consequence to be mitigated. It was treated, by and large, as an acceptable feature of the broader reform. I want to walk you through the question of why. Why did the coalition want to eliminate medical pluralism? Why was the dominance of allopathic medicine within a specific institutional framework the preferred outcome? The standard answer is scientific. The reform's promoters believed that allopathic medicine, in its post-Flexner form, was the best available medical system. They believed it was based on the most rigorous science. They believed it would produce the best patient outcomes. They believed it would, in time, be vindicated by the actual results it generated. This answer is, in part, correct. The reformers did believe that. They were, in their own terms, advocates for scientific medicine, not opponents of herbal medicine for its own sake. But there are other answers as well. One is economic. The Rockefeller fortune, which funded the foundation, derived from Standard Oil. The pharmaceutical industry that emerged in the early 20th century used petroleum-derived chemicals as feedstocks for many pharmaceutical products. The structural alignment between the Rockefeller economic interests and the post-reform pharmaceutical industry was real, even if it was not the explicit motivation for the medical education reform. Another is institutional. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and the AMA's Council on Medical Education were all institutions seeking to establish themselves as authoritative actors in American medicine. The medical education reform gave each of them a structural role. The Foundation became the principal philanthropic funder. The Carnegie Foundation became the principal evaluator of medical education. The AMA's council became the principal accreditor. The institutions, by carrying out the reform, established themselves in positions they would hold for decades. A third is ideological. The early 20th century was a period of substantial enthusiasm in American intellectual life for what was called scientific management or systematic reform. The medical education reform was one of several such reforms. The others included scientific management in industry, Frederick Winslow Taylor, scientific philanthropy, the foundation movement itself, scientific education, the secondary education reforms of the period, and scientific government, the progressive era reform movements. The medical education reform fit a broader ideological pattern that valued centralization, standardization, and expert authority over the diffuse pluralism that had characterized the 19th century. All three of these answers, economic, institutional, ideological, are, in my view, part of the full account of why the reform took the shape it did. The standard answer, that the reform was simply about scientific quality, is partial. I want to give you a breath here. We have walked through the medical landscape of 1900, the Flexner Report, the funding patterns, the licensing reforms, the closure of the eclectic schools, the Lloyd Library, the broader structural transformation of American medicine, the documents that show the coordination among the reform actors, the question of why. You do not need to hold every detail. The records are at Sleepy Hollow. The library is in Cincinnati. The Flexner Report is publicly available. The pieces of the story are there for anyone who chooses to assemble them. What I want to walk through next is the specific question of the herbal tradition. What it had developed, what was lost when it was displaced, and what the consequences have been for American healthcare in the subsequent century. Let me describe the eclectic materia medica. The eclectic tradition produced between roughly 1840 and 1923 a series of pharmacopoeias and materia medica volumes documenting the medicinal use of North American plants. The major works include John King's American Eclectic Dispensatory, first published in 1854, revised through multiple editions over the next 4 decades. Harvey Wickersfelter and John Uri Lloyd's King's American Dispensatory, published in 1898, an expansion and revision of King's earlier work. Felter's The Eclectic Materia Medica, Pharmacology and Therapeutics, published in 1922, one of the last major eclectic publications, appearing as the tradition was being institutionally dismantled. These works documented hundreds of plant species. For each species, they provided botanical description, geographical distribution, chemical composition, within the analytical limits of the period, traditional uses, clinical applications, preparation methods, dosing guidelines, and reported adverse effects. The works were not, by modern pharmacological standards, complete. They lacked the systematic randomized clinical trial data that became the gold standard of pharmaceutical evidence in the mid-20th century. They lacked the molecular-level analytical data that modern chemistry provides. They lacked the regulatory framework that the Food and Drug Administration imposed beginning in 1906, and that has since become substantially more elaborate. But the works were substantial. They represented, in aggregate, the accumulated clinical experience of thousands of physicians over decades of practice. When the eclectic schools closed, the works remained. The clinical experience that had produced them, however, ended. The continuing accumulation of new clinical data within the eclectic framework ceased. I want to walk you through a specific case. Before I do, let me walk through the question of how the reform actually proceeded, year by year, in the immediate aftermath of the Flexner Report. The report was published in June 1910. The immediate response was substantial. The major American newspapers ran extensive coverage of the report's findings. The coverage tended to be sympathetic to the reform agenda. The state licensing boards began to respond within months. The first state to formally adopt the Flexner standards in its licensing requirements was Pennsylvania, in late 1910. Within 2 years, more than a dozen states had followed. Within 5 years, the majority of states had adopted some version of the Flexner framework. The American Medical Association's Council on Medical Education made the report central to its accreditation work. The council began publishing annual ratings of medical schools. Schools that did not receive favourable ratings found their graduates increasingly unable to obtain licensure in the states that had adopted the new standards. The Rockefeller Foundation, after its formal establishment in 1913, began making grants to medical schools on the criteria the report had recommended. The first major grants went to Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. The leading allopathic schools with this funding made substantial investments. They built new laboratory facilities. They hired full-time research faculty. By 1920, the leading American medical schools were, in their facilities and faculty, substantially upgraded from their 1910 condition. The schools that did not receive the funding faced increasing competitive pressure. The eclectic schools, the homeopathic schools, the smaller allopathic schools, all found themselves operating with inferior facilities, smaller faculties, less integrated clinical training, and graduates who faced increasing licensure difficulties. Let me describe what happened year by year at one of the eclectic schools. The Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati, in 1910, was a 4-year medical school with approximately 100 students per class. Its faculty was a mix of full-time and part-time. Its facilities included a teaching laboratory, a small library, and clinical affiliations with several Cincinnati hospitals. In 1911, the institute received an unfavorable rating from the AMA's Council on Medical Education. The rating affected the licensure prospects of institute graduates in several states. In 1912, the institute began a renovation program intended to upgrade its facilities to meet the new standards. The renovation was funded primarily through local Cincinnati donors and through increased tuition revenue. In 1913, the institute extended its curriculum to a more rigorous 4-year program with additional clinical requirements. Between 1913 and 1918, the institute continued to operate, with enrollment declining gradually as students recognized the licensure difficulties they would face. The faculty made efforts to maintain the quality of instruction. The Lloyd brothers provided substantial financial support. In 1918, the institute applied for a Rockefeller Foundation grant. The application was extensive, addressing each of the criteria the foundation had established. The application was denied. In 1920, the institute's enrollment had declined to approximately 50 students per class. The financial position of the institute was increasingly precarious. In 1922, the AMA's Council on Medical Education issued a definitive rating that placed the institute below the threshold for recommended schools. In 1923, the institute's Board of Trustees voted to close the school. The board cited financial unsustainability as the primary reason. After 80 years of continuous operation, the Eclectic Medical Institute ended. Its records were dispersed. Its facilities were sold. The Lloyd Library acquired a substantial portion of the materials related to clinical practice and the materia medica. The University of Cincinnati's library acquired some administrative records. Some records were lost. The integrated picture that the unified records would have supported is, in effect, no longer available without substantial reconstruction work. I want to give a moment to what 80 years meant in this context. The institute had opened its doors in 1845. James Polk was president. The American Civil War was 16 years in the future. The germ theory of disease had not yet been formulated. Anesthesia for surgery was a year old. The medical practices of the period were, by modern standards, primitive. The institute operated through the Civil War. It operated through the Reconstruction era. It operated through the development of germ theory, the introduction of antisepsis, the development of modern surgical technique, the discovery of X-rays, the early years of public health as a discipline, the emergence of microbiology. It operated through 3 generations of faculty turnover, through changing scientific paradigms, through evolving curricular structures. By 1923, when the institute closed, it had been continuously operating for nearly 3/4 of a century. It had graduated over that period approximately 10,000 physicians. Those physicians had practiced across the eastern half of the United States, primarily but not exclusively in the Midwest. They had treated, collectively, several million patients. The institute was not, by 1923, a marginal institution. It was a substantial American medical school with a substantial historical record and an active alumni community. The closure was not the closure of a small fringe operation. It was the closure of a major American medical school whose graduates had been a significant force in Midwestern American medicine for nearly a century. That closure happened. The pattern of closures that occurred across the sectarian medical schools, across the years from approximately 1907 to 1925, eliminated, in a relatively brief institutional moment, a substantial American medical infrastructure that had been built over nearly a century. I want to describe how similar processes occurred at other sectarian schools. The Boston University School of Medicine had been founded in 1873 as a homeopathic medical school. In 1918, under pressure from the licensing reforms, the school began to integrate allopathic instruction. By 1928, all explicit homeopathic instruction had been eliminated. The Hahnemann Medical College in Philadelphia, founded in 1848 as a homeopathic school, followed a similar trajectory. By the 1920s, it had largely abandoned its homeopathic identity. The Pult College of Homeopathic Medicine in Cincinnati closed in 1911. The Bennett Medical College in Chicago, founded in 1868 as an eclectic medical school, closed in 1910. The Cincinnati College of Medicine and Surgery, founded in 1851, an eclectic allopathic hybrid, closed in 1917. The Hearing Medical College in Chicago, founded as a homeopathic school, closed in 1913. The Atlantic Medical College, founded in 1875 as an eclectic school, closed in 1907. The pattern is consistent across schools, across cities, across the different sectarian traditions. Schools that had been operating for decades, sometimes for nearly a century, closed in rapid succession between approximately 1907 and 1925. The closures were attributed, in each case, to specific local circumstances. The cumulative pattern, however, was the systematic elimination of the sectarian, medical, educational infrastructure. I want to walk through the golden seal case I mentioned earlier. The plant golden seal, Hydrastis canadensis, is native to eastern North America. It was used extensively in eclectic medicine for a range of conditions, particularly inflammatory conditions of mucous membranes. The eclectic materia medica devoted substantial attention to its preparation, dosing, and clinical applications. In 1922, in Felter's Eclectic Materia Medica, the entry on golden seal runs to several pages. It describes the plant's botany, its active constituents, within the analytical capability of the period, its preparation, its dosing for various conditions, and its observed clinical effects. The entry references clinical use over more than 70 years of eclectic practice. After the closure of the eclectic schools, golden seal essentially disappeared from the American medical mainstream. It was not, in any substantial way, incorporated into post-Flexner medical practice. Allopathic medicine did not adopt the plant. The medical schools did not teach its uses. The pharmacopoeias of the post-reform era did not include it as a standard treatment. Golden seal continued to be used by herbalists, naturopaths, and others operating outside the mainstream medical system. It was sold in health food stores, where it has remained popular to the present day. Its use has been transmitted, in attenuated form, by alternative medicine practitioners. What has not happened in the century since the eclectic schools closed is systematic medical research on golden seal at the level that the eclectic tradition had accumulated. Modern pharmacological studies have examined some of its constituents, berberine, hydrastine, and have confirmed some of the antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory effects that the eclectic tradition had reported. The modern research is, in some respects, a partial recovery of what the eclectic tradition had accumulated. The recovery is partial. The systematic clinical experience that the eclectic schools had documented is not, in the modern pharmacological literature, fully replicated. Some of what the eclectic tradition knew about golden seal is now confirmed by modern research. Some of what the eclectic tradition knew about golden seal has not been examined by modern research. Some of what the eclectic tradition knew about golden seal may have been wrong, and the modern research has shown why. What the case illustrates is the pattern. Knowledge that had been accumulated within the eclectic framework over decades of clinical practice was set aside when the framework was eliminated. Some of it has been recovered, in fragments. Most of it has not been comprehensively re-examined. I want to give similar treatment to one more plant. Bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis, was used in eclectic medicine for a range of conditions, including respiratory conditions and skin conditions. The eclectic materia medica describes its use in detail. In the post-Flexner era, bloodroot largely disappeared from American medical practice. It survived, like golden seal, primarily in alternative medicine contexts. In the late 20th century, some of its constituents, sanguinarine in particular, were rediscovered for specific applications, including dental hygiene products and, in some research contexts, oncological applications. The rediscovery, like the Golden Seal case, is partial. It recovers some of what the eclectic tradition knew. It does not comprehensively re-examine the full body of eclectic knowledge. Let me give a third plant, just to make the pattern visible. Black cohosh, Actea racemosa, was used in eclectic medicine for a range of gynecological conditions, particularly conditions associated with menopause. The eclectic Materia Medica describes its use in detail, with clinical case reports spanning multiple decades. In the post-Flexner era, black cohosh largely disappeared from American mainstream medical practice. It continued to be used by herbalists and alternative medicine practitioners. In the late 20th century, it was rediscovered by women seeking alternatives to hormone replacement therapy. Modern pharmacological studies have examined its effects on menopausal symptoms, with mixed results. Some studies have confirmed effects that the eclectic tradition had reported. Other studies have failed to confirm effects. The current pharmacological status of black cohosh is, to summarize an extensive literature, contested. What is striking in the case of black cohosh is that the modern research has been conducted largely without reference to the substantial body of eclectic clinical experience with the plant. The eclectic Materia Medica documented clinical use over decades. The modern research has, for the most part, examined the plant as if from scratch. The accumulated empirical knowledge of the tradition has not been systematically incorporated into the modern research framework. This is, I think, an important point. The eclectic tradition's accumulated knowledge is not just lost in the sense that it is not actively used. It is lost in the sense that, even when modern researchers examine the plants that the eclectic tradition examined, the researchers do not, in general, build on what the eclectic tradition had documented. They start over. Starting over has costs. The starting over researchers must rediscover, at considerable expense and over considerable time, what the eclectic tradition had already documented. Some of what the eclectic tradition documented turns out to be correct. Some turns out to be incorrect. Some has not yet been re-examined. The process of starting over does not, on its own, recover the eclectic tradition's accumulated insight efficiently. I want to walk through one specific example of what starting over costs. In the 1990s, the National Institutes of Health funded a series of research initiatives examining the pharmacology of plants that had been used in traditional American herbal medicine. The initiatives were modestly funded, a few $1 million per year, in the broader context of NIH research funding, that was by then in the tens of billions per year. The initiatives produced some useful findings. They confirmed some of the eclectic tradition's claims about specific plants. They identified active constituents in some plants. They produced clinical trial data on a handful of widely used herbs. The initiatives did not, however, produce anything like a comprehensive re-examination of the eclectic tradition. They examined a small number of plants in detail. The eclectic tradition had documented hundreds of plants in some detail. The fraction of the eclectic Materia Medica that has been comprehensively re-examined by modern research is, in my estimation, well under 5%. What this means is that more than 95% of what the eclectic tradition had documented has not, in the century since the tradition was institutionally dismantled, been comprehensively re-examined by modern pharmacological methods. Some of that 95% might be wrong. The eclectic tradition was a 19th century clinical practice, with the analytical limitations of 19th century pharmacology. Some of what the eclectic tradition believed about plant therapeutics is, by modern standards, certainly mistaken. But some of it is, presumably, correct. The eclectic tradition was an empirical clinical practice, refined over decades. It was not, in general, fantastical or speculative. Its claims about specific plants were grounded in observed clinical responses, however limited the analytical framework for understanding those responses. The substantial body of eclectic clinical knowledge that has not been re-examined by modern research is, in effect, knowledge that has been lost to American medicine. It survives in the Materia Medica volumes. It does not survive as actively used clinical knowledge. I want to walk through one more dimension of the eclectic Materia Medica that I think is worth describing. The eclectic tradition was particularly interested in what its practitioners called specific medication. This was the principle that specific plant preparations had specific therapeutic effects in specific clinical conditions, that the practitioner's job was to identify the appropriate plant for the specific clinical presentation, rather than to treat broad symptomatic categories with generalized therapies. In some respects, specific medication anticipates aspects of modern personalized medicine. The eclectic practitioner was supposed to attend to the specific presentation of the patient, identify the particular pattern of symptoms and signs, and select the plant preparation that, in clinical experience, had been observed to address that particular pattern. The framework was, in its general structure, more attuned to individual variation than the broad symptomatic prescribing that became dominant in mid-20th century allopathic medicine. The eclectic practitioner was supposed to ask questions about the specific character of the patient's complaint, the temporal pattern of symptoms, the modifying factors, the associated features, and to use that information to identify the appropriate plant. This framework, when it was working well, produced clinical encounters that were qualitatively different from the encounters that emerged in 20th century allopathic primary care. The eclectic encounter was longer. It was more conversational. It attended to dimensions of the patient's presentation that the standardized allopathic intake form did not capture. When it was working well, not all eclectic encounters worked well. The eclectic practitioner could be incompetent, or hurried, or simply mistaken about the patient's presentation. The eclectic framework did not by itself guarantee good practice. It enabled in good hands a particular kind of attention. It did not enforce it. What modern American primary care has, in significant part, lost is the institutional possibility of the longer, more attentive clinical encounter that the eclectic framework enabled. The economic structure of modern primary care, 15-minute appointments, billing-driven encounter design, electronic medical records, does not by and large allow the kind of practice that the eclectic framework was designed to support. This is one of several ways in which the structural transformation of American medicine, beyond its strictly scientific dimensions, has had consequences for what kinds of clinical practice are possible. I want to walk you through what I think this pattern means. The pattern is that a substantial body of clinical knowledge accumulated over decades within a specific therapeutic framework was displaced when that framework was institutionally dismantled. The knowledge was not destroyed in the literal sense. The materia medica volumes survive. The pharmacological observations survive. The clinical case reports survive. What was lost was the institutional framework for using, transmitting, and developing that knowledge. Without medical schools teaching the framework, without licensed practitioners using it, without journals publishing new research within it, the framework ceased to be a living tradition. It became a historical artifact. A historical artifact can be studied. It cannot, however, continue to develop. It cannot incorporate new clinical experience. It cannot respond to new diseases. It cannot evolve in the way that a living tradition can. I want to give some sense of what a living tradition looks like, in contrast to a historical artifact. A living tradition has practitioners. They use the tradition's framework in their daily work. They encounter new cases, new conditions, new patient populations. They adapt the framework to address what they encounter. They share their experiences with other practitioners. They develop new applications, refine existing applications, discard applications that prove ineffective. A living tradition has students. They learn the framework from established practitioners. They apprentice. They are tested. They are credentialed. They emerge as new practitioners who carry the tradition forward. A living tradition has institutions, schools, journals, professional associations, conferences, libraries. The institutions provide the infrastructure through which the tradition perpetuates itself. A living tradition has economic viability. Practitioners can earn a living using the tradition. Schools can fund themselves through tuition and donations. Journals can sustain publication. The tradition fits into the broader economic system in ways that allow it to continue. A living tradition has connections to adjacent fields. Botanical medicine, for example, connects to botany, to pharmacology, to clinical medicine, to public health, to nutrition science. The connections allow the tradition to draw on developments in adjacent fields and to contribute to them. A historical artifact lacks most of these. The materia medica volumes from the eclectic tradition lack contemporary practitioners using the tradition's framework in daily work. They lack contemporary students apprenticing in the framework. They lack contemporary institutions perpetuating the framework. They lack contemporary economic viability for the framework as a profession. They lack contemporary integration with adjacent scientific fields. The volumes are read. The volumes are studied by historians and by occasional pharmacological researchers. The volumes are not, however, used in the way that a living tradition uses its texts. This is what the eclectic tradition lost when the schools closed. It lost the institutional infrastructure that allowed it to be a living tradition. It became a historical artifact. The eclectic tradition, in 1923, was a living tradition. By 1939, it was a historical artifact. The transformation took 15 or so years. What we have lost as a result of that transformation is more than just the specific knowledge that the eclectic tradition had accumulated. We have lost the framework within which that knowledge could continue to grow. I want to give you a breath. I have been describing a story of institutional transformation and its consequences. The story is, in its broad outlines, well documented. The actors are identifiable, the decisions are traceable, the outcomes are visible. What is harder to describe is what this means in terms of present-day American healthcare. Modern American medicine is, in many respects, extremely successful. It has produced dramatic improvements in life expectancy, infant mortality, surgical outcomes, treatment of acute conditions, and the management of many chronic diseases. The post-Flexner system, in its substantive accomplishments, has been one of the great institutional achievements of the 20th century. Modern American medicine is also, in many respects, deeply problematic. It is enormously expensive. It is dominated by pharmaceutical and medical device industries whose interests do not always align with patient welfare. It produces high rates of medication-related adverse events. It is poorly integrated with the kind of preventive and lifestyle-oriented approaches that contributed substantially to the herbalist traditions. The problems and the successes are connected. The post-Flexner system's institutional structure, its dominance by pharmaceutical research, its emphasis on technical intervention over lifestyle modification, its high-cost capital-intensive infrastructure, produces both the dramatic, acute care successes and the systemic problems with chronic care, cost, and over-medication. The herbalist traditions that were eliminated by the reform would not have prevented the problems. They had their own deficiencies, but they would have provided, alongside the post-Flexner system, an alternative framework that emphasized different things: patient observation, plant-based interventions, lifestyle approaches, slower clinical relationships. A medical system that had retained both the post-Flexner scientific medicine and the eclectic botanical tradition would perhaps have produced better outcomes on dimensions where the current system struggles. I want to expand on this point. The post-Flexner system is, by historical standards, an extraordinary institution. It has produced acute care results that would have been incomprehensible to the medical practitioners of 1900. Antibiotics, vaccines, modern surgical technique, anesthesia, blood banking, intensive care, organ transplantation, modern cancer treatment. These are achievements of a medical system that the Flexner reform helped to create. The achievements are real. They have saved enormous numbers of lives. The same system that produces these acute care achievements struggles with chronic care. Type 2. Diabetes is increasingly common and poorly managed. Cardiovascular disease, despite enormous research investment, remains the leading cause of death. Autoimmune conditions are increasing in prevalence. Mental health conditions are widespread and inadequately treated. Obesity, with its broad metabolic consequences, has become epidemic. The chronic care problems are, in significant part, problems that the eclectic traditions framework would have been more suited to address. The eclectic framework emphasized lifestyle modification, dietary intervention, gentle pharmacological support, and the long-term patient relationship. These are precisely the elements that modern chronic care management requires, and that the contemporary American medical system, with its acute care focus and brief encounter design, often fails to provide. A medical system that had retained the eclectic framework alongside the post-Flexner scientific medicine would have provided two different orientations. one for acute conditions where scientific medicine excels, and one for chronic conditions, where the eclectic emphasis on lifestyle, diet, and gentle intervention would have been more appropriate. The two orientations could have been complementary. They could have served the patient population through their different strengths. This counterfactual is, again, not testable. We cannot know what such a system would have produced. We can observe what the current system produces and what it struggles with. We can observe what the eclectic tradition emphasized and what its framework was suited to address. The match between what the current system struggles with and what the eclectic framework emphasized is, in my view, suggestive. It would have been less coherent institutionally. It would have been pluralistic in ways that the modern medical economic complex would not have favoured, but it might have been better for patients. That counterfactual is, of course, not testable. We cannot know what American medicine would look like today if the eclectic tradition had survived. We can only observe what the eliminated tradition was, what the eliminating reform did, and what the resulting system has and has not been able to accomplish. I want to walk through the question of they in this story. They refers to a specific coalition of actors who, between 1908 and 1939, carried out the transformation of American medical education. The actors are knowable. Their names are in the historical record. They include Abraham Flexner, the author of the report. They include Henry S. Pritchett, the Carnegie Foundation president who commissioned the report. They include Simon Flexner, Abraham's brother, who headed the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research and who was influential in shaping the Foundation's medical education priorities. They include Frederick T. Gates, the Rockefeller philanthropic advisor, whose internal memoranda articulated the Foundation's strategic approach. They include Wallace Buttrick, the General Education Board Secretary, who managed the day-to-day operations of the Medical Education Funding Program. They include John D. Rockefeller Sr. and John D. Rockefeller Jr., who provided the philanthropic capital. They include William H. Welch, the Johns Hopkins Medical School Dean, who served as the model for the post-Flexner Medical School, and who was influential in the broader reform. They include the leadership of the American Medical Association's Council on Medical Education, who provided the professional association framework for the reform. They include the leadership of the state licensing boards in the dozens of states that adopted the Flexner standards. They include the leadership of the leading medical schools, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Yale, Columbia, Washington University in St. Louis, who became the institutional beneficiaries of the reform. The list could be extended further to include the foundation officers, the academic medical leaders, the policy advisors, and the various intermediaries who made the coalition function. They is, in this story, a coalition of identifiable individuals operating in identifiable institutional roles. The coalition did not act in secret. Its activities were, in the main, conducted through formal channels: published reports, foundation grants, professional association proceedings, state legislative processes. What the coalition did, however, was significantly more than what its public statements described. The public statements emphasized scientific quality improvement. The actual outcome was the elimination of medical pluralism, the establishment of a specific institutional framework as dominant, and the creation of conditions favorable to the subsequent growth of the pharmaceutical industry. I want to walk through one specific institution before I close. The Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati, Ohio, was founded in 1845. It was the leading school of eclectic medicine for nearly 80 years. It produced thousands of graduates over its lifetime. It supported substantial faculty research and publication. It was, by 1900, a major institution of American medicine. In 1923, it closed. I want to describe what closure meant. The faculty dispersed. Some retired. Some accepted positions at allopathic schools, where they generally taught general medical subjects rather than eclectic frameworks. Some entered private practice, often in modified forms that adapted to the new licensing environment. Some left medicine. The student body, mid-curriculum, transferred to other institutions where they could complete their training. The transfers were typically to schools that did not teach the eclectic framework. The students completed allopathic curricula. The school's physical assets were liquidated. The library, which had been part of the Lloyd Library, survived in the Lloyd Brothers Independent Institution. The teaching equipment was sold. The buildings were sold for other uses. The records of the school, administrative records, student records, faculty correspondence, were preserved in fragmented form across several institutions. The Lloyd Library holds some. The American Medical Association archives hold some. The University of Cincinnati's library holds some. What did not survive, in any institutional form, was the school itself. The Eclectic Medical Institute, as an active educational institution, ended in 1923. The eclectic tradition continued, in attenuated form, through individual practitioners who had been trained at the institute or at similar schools. Those practitioners aged, they retired, they died. They did not in general train successors because the institutional pathway for training had been closed. By the 1950s, there were essentially no actively practicing eclectic physicians in the United States. The tradition, as a living practice, had ended. I want to walk through what this means in terms of the transmission of knowledge. A living medical tradition transmits knowledge through several channels. Apprenticeship, where experienced practitioners teach new practitioners through direct clinical instruction. Schools, where curricula codify the tradition's framework and transmit it to large numbers of students. Texts, where written materials preserve the framework for reference and study. Professional associations, where practitioners share clinical experience and develop new applications. Journals, where research and case reports document evolving practice. When all of these channels are disrupted, the tradition cannot perpetuate itself. The eclectic tradition lost its schools first, in the closures between 1907 and 1923. It lost its professional associations as those associations declined alongside the schools. It lost its journals as the journals ceased publication for lack of subscribers. The texts remained, but without practitioners to use them, the texts became historical artifacts rather than working documents. The apprenticeship channel, where individual practitioners might have continued to train successors, operated for a generation, but could not, without the supporting infrastructure, sustain a new generation of practitioners. By the 1950s, the channels were all closed. The tradition had no functioning transmission mechanism. It existed, if at all, in the personal practices of aging individuals who had been trained before the institutional collapse and who were not, in general, training successors. By the 1970s, the last of the eclectic trained physicians were retiring or dying. By the 1990s, they were essentially all gone. What survived was the texts. What did not survive was the living transmission. The tradition existed in the libraries. It did not exist in the world. This is the difference between preservation and continuation. The texts have been preserved. The tradition has not been continued. I want to give you a moment to sit with that. A tradition that had been integrated into American medicine for nearly a century, that had produced thousands of practitioners, that had accumulated a substantial body of clinical and pharmacological knowledge, that had operated through dedicated medical schools and professional associations and journals, ended within a span of 15 years. The end was not violent. No one was imprisoned. No texts were burned. The materia medica volumes remained in libraries. The graduates continued to live their lives. The end was institutional. The framework that allowed the tradition to continue was dismantled. Without the framework, the tradition could not perpetuate itself. This is a particular kind of ending. It is the kind of ending that an industrial society can produce through ordinary processes of professional regulation and philanthropic funding, without anyone needing to make a dramatic decision. The tradition simply has no place to continue. The Flexner Report did not call for the destruction of the eclectic tradition. The Rockefeller Foundation did not, in any document I have found, call for the destruction of the eclectic tradition. The American Medical Association did not, in any document I have found, call for the destruction of the eclectic tradition. The eclectic tradition was nonetheless eliminated. It was eliminated by the cumulative effect of decisions that, in each individual case, were defensible on grounds other than the elimination of the eclectic tradition. The Flexner Report's evaluations were defensible on grounds of educational standards. The Rockefeller funding patterns were defensible on grounds of institutional priorities. The AMA's licensing reforms were defensible on grounds of professional standards. The decisions added up. I want to spend a moment with the question of whether what happened was avoidable. The transformation of American medical education in the 1910s and 1920s occurred in a particular historical context. The progressive era was at its peak. Scientific medicine was making genuine and dramatic advances. The German university model was being widely admired in American intellectual circles. The American Medical Association was consolidating its professional authority. The major philanthropic foundations were establishing themselves as institutional actors. State licensing boards were professionalizing their work. Given all of these factors, some kind of medical education reform was probably going to happen. The pre-reform American medical landscape was, in many respects, genuinely inadequate. Some consolidation was probably needed, some quality improvement was probably necessary. What was not, in my view, inevitable was the specific shape the reform took. The reform that occurred eliminated medical pluralism. A different reform, one that improved quality without eliminating pluralism, was, in principle, possible. The German university model could have been adapted to coexist with continued sectarian traditions. The licensing reforms could have required quality standards without requiring uniform adherence to a single therapeutic framework. The foundation funding could have supported diverse approaches rather than concentrating on a single approach. These alternative paths were not, in 1910, technically impossible. They were, however, not the paths that the coalition pursued. The coalition pursued the elimination of pluralism rather than its preservation, alongside quality improvements. The choice to eliminate pluralism rather than to preserve it alongside reform was a choice. The choice was made by identifiable individuals operating in identifiable institutional roles with identifiable interests in the elimination of pluralism. The choice was not forced by the technical requirements of medical education reform. The choice was an expression of the coalition's preferences about what kind of medical system should exist in the United States. A different coalition with different preferences could have produced a different reform. The reform that occurred reflected the preferences of the specific coalition that carried it out. I want to walk through one more dimension before I close. It is the question of what the title of tonight's story claims. The title is The Real Reason America Replaced Every Herbal School in 1913. It had nothing to do with medicine. I want to be honest about what I have and have not established. I have not established that the reform had nothing to do with medicine. The reform did have to do with medicine. The Flexner Report's evaluations of school quality were, in many cases, technically correct. The post-reform medical schools did produce better trained physicians. The medical outcomes did improve in measurable ways over the subsequent decades. The reform had to do with medicine. It also had to do with other things. I have established that the reform had to do with institutional power. The reform positioned a specific coalition, the leading allopathic schools, the major foundations, the AMA, as the dominant force in American medicine. The positioning was, by 1915, substantially complete. I have established that the reform had to do with economics. The post-reform medical system created market conditions favourable to the pharmaceutical industry, the medical device industry, and the hospital-based capital-intensive care model that has dominated American medicine since. I have established that the reform had to do with ideology. The reform fit within the broader early 20th century enthusiasm for scientific standardization and expert authority that characterized the progressive era. The title's claim that the reform had nothing to do with medicine is, strictly, an overstatement. The reform did have to do with medicine. A more accurate claim would be the reform had to do with much more than medicine, and the additional dimensions have been less fully addressed by the standard historiography than the strictly medical dimensions have been. The title trades some accuracy for emphasis. I want to be clear that I am aware of the trade. I want to walk through one more dimension before I bring this to a close. It is the question of how the historiographical framing has been maintained. The standard historiography of the Flexner Reform, as I have noted, emphasizes the quality improvement and de-emphasizes the structural transformation. The de-emphasis is not, in my view, accidental. It has been maintained over more than a century by specific institutional and disciplinary practices. The first practice is the institutional control of the medical history field. The history of medicine is, as a discipline, substantially funded and institutionally housed within medical schools, medical history societies that have close ties to the medical profession, and foundations that have ongoing relationships with the contemporary medical establishment. The Wellcome Trust the major British philanthropic funder of medical history, has direct historical connections to the early 20th century pharmaceutical industry. The American Association for the History of Medicine has close institutional ties to the AMA and the leading medical schools. These ties are not, in themselves, disqualifying. Many fields are funded by institutions with interests in the fields. The funding does, however, create soft pressures that shape what kinds of histories are likely to be produced. The second practice is the framing of the reform within the broader narrative of scientific progress. The standard narrative of 20th century American medicine is a narrative of scientific advance. The discovery of vitamins, antibiotics, vaccines, surgical techniques, diagnostic tools. The Flexner Reform is, within this narrative, the institutional foundation that enabled the scientific advance, questioning the reform risks, questioning the broader narrative. The third practice is the marginalization of alternative readings. Researchers who have argued that the reform had significant non-medical dimensions have, by and large, not been treated as serious scholars by the mainstream history of medicine. Their work has been published in alternative health venues, in journals with smaller circulations and less prestige. The mainstream has not engaged substantively with the alternative readings. The combined effect of these practices is that the standard historiography has been remarkably stable over more than a century. The framing established in the 1910s and 1920s, that the reform was a triumph of scientific medicine, has persisted with relatively few substantive challenges in the mainstream literature. The persistence is not because the alternative readings are entirely without merit. The alternative readings, in their various forms, have raised observations and questions that the mainstream has not adequately addressed. The persistence is because the institutional and disciplinary practices that shape the field have not, in general, rewarded researchers who pursue the alternative readings. I want to give one more breath here. We have walked through a great deal: the medical landscape of 1900, the Flexner Report and its origins, the Rockefeller funding, the licensing reforms, the closure of the eclectic schools, the Lloyd Library, the dynamics of how a living tradition becomes a historical artifact, the standard historiography and how it has been maintained. You do not need to hold every detail. The story is in the records. The records are accessible. The Rockefeller Archive Center is in Sleepy Hollow. The Lloyd Library is in Cincinnati. The National Library of Medicine is in Bethesda. The Flexner Report is publicly available online. Any researcher who chooses to assemble the pieces can do so. I have been sitting with this story for about 4 months. I came to it from a different research project on American philanthropic foundations, and I stayed with it because the more I read in the foundation archives, the more I found that the standard historiography of the medical education reform did not adequately address what the reform actually did. The standard historiography emphasizes the quality improvement. The quality improvement was real. The standard historiography does not equally emphasize the structural transformation. The structural transformation was also real. The structural transformation eliminated American medical pluralism. It eliminated the eclectic tradition specifically. It positioned a specific coalition in dominant position. It set the stage for the subsequent growth of the pharmaceutical industry and the broader medical economic complex that characterizes modern American healthcare. These outcomes have shaped American medicine for more than a century. They continue to shape it now. I want to give you a final breath here. The story I have walked through tonight is, in some sense, a story about how institutions die. I want to spend one more moment with how this story compares to the other erasure stories I have worked on. In the Smithsonian Giant Skeletons case, the erasure happened through catalogue reorganization and editorial softening. The physical evidence was preserved, the link to the public record was severed. In the Star Fort case, if there is erasure, it operates through the inheritance of an under-theorized architectural form. The form was transmitted without explicit derivation. The reasons for its specific features were never fully articulated. In the Antarctic case, the erasure happens through classification and treaty restriction. The operational record was substantially preserved. The interpretation and follow-up were institutionally restricted. In this medical education case, the erasure happens through institutional dismantling. The texts were preserved, the living tradition was not. The 4 cases share a pattern. The information in each case is not destroyed. The institutional framework that would have made the information actionable is dismantled. The result is that the information exists in archives, libraries, and historical records, but cannot easily be used in ongoing practice or research. This pattern is, I think, the modern form of erasure. It is not the form of erasure that the great library fires of antiquity represent, direct destruction of materials. It is a different form, suited to industrial societies with strong archival traditions. The materials are preserved. The use of the materials is institutionally constrained. The constraint is invisible from outside the institution. The information exists. The practical possibility of using the information is, in effect, closed. The eclectic tradition did not die because it was wrong. It did not die because it had no value. It did not die because better alternatives proved that it was unnecessary. It died because the institutional framework that supported it was dismantled by a coalition that had specific interests in establishing a different framework. The dismantling was, by the standards of the period, not unusual. American institutions in the early 20th century were being reshaped along similar lines in many fields: education, philanthropy, public health, government administration, industrial management. The medical education reform was one instance of a broader pattern, but the medical education reform had particular consequences. It involved the elimination of a tradition that had accumulated, over decades, a substantial body of knowledge about plant-based medicine. The knowledge has been only partially recovered in subsequent decades. We are, as a society, poorer for the loss. The post-Flexner medical system has been, in its accomplishments, substantial. The full picture of what American medicine could have been, if it had retained both the post-Flexner science and the eclectic botanical tradition, is not knowable. We have only what we have. I want to spend a moment with the question of what is at stake in remembering this story. If the story were merely about the loss of 19th century medical traditions, it would be a story of historical interest only. We do not, by and large, mourn the loss of 19th century medical traditions. Many of them deserve to be lost. The medical practices of 1850, bloodletting, mercury treatments, calomel, were, in many cases, actively harmful. The standard allopathic medicine of the early 19th century has been substantially superseded for good reasons. The eclectic tradition is, in some sense, different. It was a herbal tradition that, while not perfect, was based on relatively gentle interventions that worked with the body's own healing processes. It accumulated empirical knowledge about plants that, in their concentrated pharmaceutical forms, would later be recognized as having significant therapeutic properties. The tradition was, by the standards of late 19th century medicine, relatively conservative. That is, it tended to do less harm than some of the more aggressive allopathic interventions of the same period. If the eclectic tradition had survived alongside the post-Flexner scientific medicine, it would have provided a parallel framework for certain kinds of clinical care. Primary care, particularly for chronic conditions. Women's health, particularly around menopause and reproductive issues. Some pediatric conditions, some skin conditions, some digestive conditions. The parallel framework would have been imperfect. It would have had limitations. It would have been complementary to, rather than a replacement for, the scientific medicine that the Flexner Reform institutionalized. The complementary framework does not exist. The Flexner Reform produced not a system in which scientific medicine and the eclectic tradition coexisted, but a system in which scientific medicine displaced the eclectic tradition entirely. The displacement has had costs. The costs include the loss of specific knowledge about plant therapeutics. The costs also include the loss of an institutional framework for the kind of clinical practice that the eclectic tradition supported. The longer encounter, the empirical attention to individual variation, the gentle intervention oriented towards supporting healing rather than aggressively treating disease. Modern American medicine has, in various ways, tried to recover some of what was lost. Family medicine emerged as a specialty in the 1960 seconds, in part as a response to the perceived inadequacy of specialist-dominated medicine for primary care. Integrative medicine and functional medicine have emerged more recently as attempts to incorporate non-allopathic frameworks into mainstream practice. These efforts have produced useful results, but the efforts are partial. They operate within a medical economic system that does not, in general, reward the kind of practice the eclectic tradition supported. The system's incentives, short visits, procedural billing, pharmaceutical-oriented therapy, push against the practices that integrative and functional medicine attempt to revive. The result is that the framework the eclectic tradition embodied is, more than a century after its institutional dismantling, only partially recovered. I've been thinking about how to summarize what this story shows. The summary is not, in the end, a dramatic one. It is a story of institutional transformation through ordinary channels, producing outcomes that exceed what the public-facing justifications described. The institutional transformation happened. The transformation eliminated a substantial American medical tradition. The actors who carried out the transformation were identifiable individuals operating in identifiable institutional roles. Their motivations were mixed, partly scientific, partly institutional, partly economic, partly ideological. The outcomes shaped American medicine for more than a century. The story is well documented at the level of what happened. The story is less well developed at the level of why. The standard historiography has tended to absorb the why into the scientific dimension, treating the reform as a story of scientific quality improvement. The fuller story includes the institutional, economic, and ideological dimensions that the standard treatment does not foreground. In 1913, the United States had approximately 155 medical schools. By 1923, that number had been cut roughly in half. By 1939, every Herbal medical school in the country had been closed. The closures were driven by a report published in 1910 by the Carnegie Foundation. The report was technically accurate in many of its evaluations. The reform that followed went well beyond what the report's strict findings would have required. The reform was carried out by a coalition that included the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the American Medical Association's Council on Medical Education, and the leading allopathic medical schools. The coalition operated through ordinary institutional channels, published reports, foundation grants, state licensing reforms, professional accreditation. The coalition did not operate in secret. The activities of the coalition were, in the main, visible in the public record. What the coalition did, however, was more than what its public statements described. The public statements emphasized scientific quality improvement. The actual outcome was the elimination of medical pluralism and the establishment of a specific institutional framework as dominant. The gap between the public statements and the actual outcome is, in my view, the historiographical question that has not been adequately addressed. The coalition's interests were not strictly medical. They included institutional power, economic positioning, an ideological commitment to a particular model of scientific standardization. The reform eliminated American medical pluralism. It eliminated the eclectic medical tradition specifically. It positioned the coalition as the dominant force in American medicine for the subsequent century. The materia medica volumes from the eclectic tradition remain in libraries. The institutional framework that produced them is gone. The clinical knowledge they accumulated has been only partially recovered by subsequent research. I want to give one more breath here. The story of the eclectic tradition is, in some sense, a story about how civilizations lose knowledge. The loss does not happen through dramatic events. It happens through institutional transformations, whose individual decisions are defensible, but whose cumulative effect is the elimination of a body of accumulated insight. Civilizations have lost knowledge in this way, many times. Ancient libraries have burned, schools of philosophy have closed, craft traditions have been displaced by industrial alternatives. The pattern of loss is, in human history, common. What is striking about the eclectic case is how recent it is. The Eclectic Medical Institute closed in 1923, that is, in historical terms, the day before yesterday. People who studied at the Institute in their 20s lived well into the 1980s. The institutional dismantling of the eclectic tradition is recent enough that we have, in our cultural memory, the resources to reconstruct what was lost. The reconstruction has not, in any sustained way, been carried out. The institutional incentives that shape historical research, medical research, and pharmaceutical research have not, in general, favoured the kind of integrated re-examination that would recover what the eclectic tradition had developed. The volumes wait, the records wait, the opportunity to reconstruct what was lost wait. Whether the reconstruction will ever be carried out depends, as so many historical questions do, on what kinds of investigations the institutions and the disciplines choose to support. The records are at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow. The library is at the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati. The Flexner Report is publicly available. The closure dates of the schools are documented. The story is, in its broad outlines, knowable. I want to walk through one more dimension before closing. The Flexner reform is sometimes presented, in modern discussions, as if it were a uniquely American phenomenon. It was not. Comparable medical education reforms occurred in Britain, Germany, France, and other industrial nations during the same period. The British General Medical Council had been performing similar functions since 1858. The German Medical Association had standardized its medical education along lines that the Flexner Report would, in the United States, attempt to emulate. The international context matters. The American reform was, in significant part, an effort to bring American medical education into line with what was happening in other industrial nations. The motivations were not, in this dimension, conspiratorial. They were, in significant part, reflective of broader patterns of professionalization that were occurring across industrial societies in the early 20th century. This international context does not eliminate the specific consequences of the American reform. The eclectic tradition was an American tradition. Its elimination was specific to American medicine. The reform that eliminated it was an American reform, carried out by American actors in response to American conditions. But the international context places the reform within a broader historical pattern. The professionalization of medical practice, the standardization of medical education, the consolidation of authority within specific institutional frameworks. These were not unique to the United States. They were features of industrial society in the early 20th century, manifesting in various national contexts with various national consequences. The story is, in its broad outlines, knowable. The story is also, in the standard historiography, told in a way that emphasizes the quality improvement and de-emphasizes the structural transformation. The de-emphasis is not, in my view, neutral. It functions to make the reform appear as something it was not, a purely scientific improvement, without significant institutional, economic, or ideological dimensions. The full story includes the other dimensions. I have been sitting with this story for 4 months. I came to it from research on philanthropic foundations. I stayed with it because the more I read in the foundation archives, the more clearly I saw a pattern that the standard historiography had not addressed. The pattern is documented. The actors are known. The outcomes are visible. What remains to be done is the kind of integrated re-examination that would situate the reform within its full institutional and economic context, and that would recover what the eliminated tradition had developed. The re-examination has not been done at the level of detail the question warrants. It could be done. The archives are accessible, the methods exist, the opportunity remains. Whether it will be done is, as always, a function of which questions the institutions and the disciplines decide to pursue. Thank you for staying with me through this story.